All right, hello everyone and welcome. We're so excited to have you all here. Before we begin, I would just like to start with a land acknowledgement. So we'd like to acknowledge the land that we're meeting on is the people and land of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. Our work in Toronto also takes place in the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nation, Inuit, Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with Mississaugas of the Credit. We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of many Indigenous communities across the entire world. In 1987, the World Commissions on Environmental and Development's report, titled Our Common Futures, highlighted the great loss to humanity posed by the disappearance of Indigenous peoples and their traditional knowledge and experience. We value the significant history and contemporary contributions of local and regional First Nations and all Indigenous peoples of North America and across the world. We're thankful for the opportunity to learn, live, and work on these lands. I'd like to now hand it over to Alex to introduce the pavilion.
Hello, everybody. I'm Alex Venuto. I'm the acting deputy director of the World Urban Pavilion in Regent Park by Daniels. And we are the host of this session, the series that we're calling Pavilion Talks. We look forward to continuing to have more of these sessions throughout the rest of the year and for the foreseeable future. So please stay tuned for more messaging around that. For those of you that don't know, the World Urban Pavilion is a global knowledge exchange hub for sustainable urbanization and best practices. And we are a strategic collaboration between Urban Economy Forum, UN Habitat, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and our private sector partners, the Daniels Corporation as well. Importantly, the pavilion was recognized by United Nations as a hub for SEG cities, helping to build the capacity of cities through urban data and knowledge, strategic planning, decision-making, and ultimately for impact investing. Over the last several years, the pavilion has taken a key focus in working in three critical areas. That being knowledge, innovation, and transformation. Transformation in the form of solutions. In working in the field of knowledge, we're trying to understand better the urban data, the use of urban data, the use of knowledge, to understand how that can inform the form and function of our cities. We're working in innovations and understanding how we can connect what was previously disconnected, whether that be through housing and transport, or whether that be through open spaces and community commons as well. And then finally, we are working in the form of transformations. And as I said, transformation in the form of solutions, in the form of global pilots. How can we have something tangible? How can we use those two previous subjects, knowledge and innovations, and how can we demonstrate it through tangible and real examples on how it can transform the way our cities are functioning, and how it can have a real impact on the everyday lives of people and the cities and communities as well. I'll turn it back over to Alyssa now to introduce our speaker for this first session of Pavilion Talks.
Amazing, thank you, Alex. So before we get started on that, I just want to run quickly the agenda, what will happen. So we'll hear from our speaker, and then we will run through a quick Q&A. And so the chat is enabled for anyone with any questions, so feel free to leave any questions that you have there. So we are absolutely honored to have Dr. Khonsari here with us today. Dr. Khonsari is co-founder and director of the Urbanist Public Art and Architectural Practice, Public Works, since 2004, an interdisciplinary practice working on co-production methods in art, architecture, urbanism, system thinking, and citizenship. Public Works is also on the GLA's and ADU's framework. Their strategic design practice focuses on transformational design, science as a form of inquiry, and design interventions as a form of new urban imagery. Her projects directly impact public space, democratic governance, and community development. She works with local organizations, communities, government bodies, and stakeholders. During 23 years in academic teaching in architecture and design, she's currently teaching on the suite of postgraduate and doctoral courses. She wrote called Design for Cultural Commons at London Metropolitan University, where she's the course leader. She is the unit master of the Architectural Association. She's currently visiting professor at International University of Barcelona on the MA Emergency Architecture. Torange delivered a TED Talk on harnessing the power of civic commons. We are very honored to have her here, so without further ado, Dr. Hans, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor to be in this platform, and actually I'm very moved and grateful about also the recognition of the Indigenous knowledge, which I have very much been inspired by throughout my profession in a way. So without further ado, I start sharing my slides. Here we are. I'll go. So I can't really see what else is happening. So here we are. So I have really been, I suppose, looking very on the ground, not just looking, but practicing community engagement to a point that I feel it is a craft, and it is actually something which is much more tangible, emotional than maybe some of the abstract ways that it's sometimes talked about in policy. And I'm going to particularly talk about the notion of the new commons as kind of this arena of this different logic of engaging people and communities and community development. So this sphere of community, it's almost very useful to think about it as a concept of family within neighborhoods. So it is embedded very much in everyday experience, not necessarily in big politics. Not that it doesn't relate to big politics, but it is not in itself big politics. It's about social relationships such as trust, familiarity, care, and emotional relationships, which can be conflicts as well and can be productive or destructive. Like, we have to be aware of all of those potentials of relationships. It is not about the public as an average many, which is what I suppose the state is much more engaged with, but the new commons is much more about communities. You can think about it as communities of interest, but you would know people within it, and you can scale up in very different ways, which I will talk about. Development of culture of collaboration rather than competition. Time is not contained within constraints of political cycles or market efficiency. It has a different forms of governance. We can take, for example, the commons governance, such as Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize, and she has 8 principles that she talks about, but there's much, much more around this kind of notions of collaborative governance, which is emerging. The ethics is much more around care. There are elements, of course, of justice-based ethics, but in itself, justice-based ethics is much more individualistic and could be much more about you're wrong, I'm right, and so on and so forth, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't have that. It's just that it's one of the forms of justice that we have to also but consider. Listening, honesty, rather than sometimes mechanics of accountability, and I can talk about that in the discussion, what I mean by that. And it's much more around relational power than concentrated power in the hands of singular people. So, like, understanding that as having very different logic shows us that why we have certain obstacles within a community sphere, if you like, within cities, or actually within politics even. So the obstacles we have is that power relations in decision making sometimes are quite concentrated, and also they're not necessarily decisions that influence and that actually matter. So that's really important. Consultation is not really meaningful engagement, which is probably known by now in many spheres. Power relations, there are also a lot of power relationships in community organizations. So what we've kind of been developing is how we can do power mapping, co-producing power maps. And this is really, really useful, not comfortable, completely uncomfortable, and a lot of people don't like it, but it's really important. And then also understanding power relationship between the state and communities. And so a lot of community groups compete over resources, be it volunteers, be it spaces, be it land, be it funds. Methods and time to build and develop trust relationships takes a lot of time and money. So we have to be aware and be creative how that can happen. Lack of awareness that community organizing and democratic empowering management also requires emotional knowledge and skill. And not understanding how to develop empowering programs is some of the problems that exist within the community organization sphere, because it's just not known that you would have a different kind of education to develop for the community sphere. So I suppose in my research and also in my doctoral, what became very clear is that these are three different logics. So the public or the state has a very different logic. It is funded in, say, through taxes, should be through more, it's our public giving in a way. The private, we know it's the market and it's, through profits. And then the commons, which is the sphere of community, which is what I was talking about, actually doesn't have a funding. It's mainly doesn't have a sustainable one. And this is something we're quite interested in economically to think. So what could be the economic model for the commons? Because at the moment, grants and volunteering is not really a sustainable way to develop that. And so because they have very different logics, the state around regulation, around, looking at the many, it's what's good for all of us in a way, at least that's what it should be, and not self-interest. And the private is about making money. And we're all very aware of public-private partnership, but what if we had commons public partnership and with the support of the private? So actually, it's not about getting rid of one or the other and having hegemonic relationships, but it's about how these collaborate with each other and have equal power. So, especially in the UK right now, we have the neoliberal thinking is really about getting rid of weakening the state as much as possible, which is very problematic. So, and strengthening the private. And that has huge implications for the commons and the state. So the diagram just doesn't work. The system becomes skewed. So, and I want to just describe that in a community garden that with my neighbors, when we were testing, what communities might want, was this kind of abandoned site, which is a public land. So the local authority, the local municipality told us that it has to be a park. So it has to be open to all. And then you can have food growing as part of it, which are what these beds are. And so then we set up the Friends of Abbey Gardens with local residents, and we managed, so we had a lease and we managed these beds. Now, the land is public, like the blue one that I just talked about, and the beds are commons. It's run by the community, and it has a membership, and you can become members. So we have a partnership, of course, but because this is open and public, people just thought they can just come and take the vegetables. And that started to create all sorts of conflict between the members and the general public, because the message was, this is a park, so you can take whatever you want, but actually people were spending a lot of time taking care of these vegetables for us to have collective eating and so on and so forth. So that may be, and of course, then we have to run a cafe. So there's the private kind of side of it. But, you know, in a way, the cafe is not somewhere which has a big footfall. So still the commercialization of it hasn't quite worked. So we're still dependent on grants, which I think is the reason why we think we need a different economics. I want to now just very briefly in one slide talk about what a commons organization could be, as opposed to current organizational forms that we know, which are centralized and top down. So Public Works, I'm one of the founding directors. But as we wanted to grow it, we didn't really feel we wanted to have, like, it wasn't important for us to have a singular point of authority, but we wanted it to grow to actually have impact within community sphere, within public sphere, and social justice and common good. So what we decided to do was to collaborate with, I mean, in our case, with a lot of our ex-students, architecture students, and we said to them, if you start to develop your own particular interest that you're very passionate about, then you can develop that within the practice as long as it aligns with our manifesto, and you can develop your own client body, your own projects, and so on and so forth. So actually you can really grow personally and professionally, and then you become a director. So in a way we are 9 directors, and then we have collaborators, be it other organizations or be it people who want to become directors. We don't have so many employees, which confuses the kind of the company house all the time. That why do you have so many directors and not that many employees? And so you grow horizontally, and it means you make decisions horizontally. And we all put 20% into a collective pot that goes for the common good. And it's a non-for-profit. So anyway, the profits goes back into the system. You can also have a share system, a non-for-profit system, but there is a fair shares model. I don't have time to talk about all these organizational systems too much, but I just wanted to say, so the organization also operates as a commons. It's not just that we produce commons projects. Now, I just want to show a couple of other projects. Now, for the sphere of community to really sustain and grow, you need space. You need community groups to have space to be visible, to be able to do things, and to be able to make change and to collaborate with other organizations. So this notion, and it came from Tom Dobson, one of our directors, this idea of not so much public, he called it public land grab, but it's how do we secure and sustain public land from everything becoming privatized, everything becoming commercialized. So I found this piece of land, and with our students, we put this kind of, and local residents, we put this temporary structure, which was a classroom. So we would have our architecture classes out with the doors open. Anybody could come and join our sessions and our tutorials. And then we had different events, cooking events, talks, and so on and so forth. And through those events that we had, we started to understand what the local community were interested in, what they really wanted. And we created this feasibility report as the social impact and social value report, to then negotiate with the landowners, which was a housing association, to actually for a community organization, which we did a call out, and the Roman Road Trust won the bid as a local residents organization to then develop it into a permanent building. So this is the common room now as a permanent building, which it's a very tiny space, but it was really an experiment for us about how we could do that from the ground up rather than from the top down, because who is going to, from the top down, is other than maybe local governments are going to come, and they wouldn't really do something that small, would come and kind of give you money to do a tiny building. But what's important about tiny buildings for communities is that they can't manage really big buildings. They don't have the resources or the capacity or sometimes even the knowledge. So they can scale up by starting with with small spaces and scaling up to big ones. But whilst we were doing all those in the temporary building, we had people who then said, oh, we would like to develop orchards or allotments. And we continued to negotiate those with landowners. So we created orchards, allotments across that kind of neighborhood. So although it's a small site, you start to expand, taking over spaces and developing different community projects with different communities. And I'm no longer there. So you have to institute and basically train local people to run local organizations, to sustain them. You need to institute organizations, and that's where the commons come in again. And again, bigger than that, how do you do ground up urban planning in a way where the communities can have a say in the policies that in a way are for a neighborhood. So the Conservative government in the UK David Cameron passed a law which is called the Localism Act to 2011. And in that, they actually devolved a lot of power from the state. They said to communities, some people read that as to the private sector, but actually I think if you're interested in the community sector, this is really, really interesting legal framework to do things like this neighborhood planning. So this actually took 5 years I only supported the first bit of it. But when we were again in the temporary space, we started to get people on board to start to do a neighborhood plan. And what this one shows, this drawing, is really we created, so this is 20,000 people in Bow in East London. And we created, with the communities, we said, so if we break it down, these 20,000 to smaller neighborhoods of about 3,000, where we can have ambassadors for each one of those smaller neighborhoods, and actually start to have events in public spaces in each one of those smaller neighborhoods, could we start to engage a lot of people? We engaged a lot of people until we came up, this went on for 9 months to set up where the boundary of the neighborhood is. So these were assemblies, lots of events in like local markets, in schools, in those kind of public spaces, and so on and so forth. And the reason why you see these little wobbles on there is because people came and said, oh, we want our street to be part of it, and so on and so forth. So it's properly ground up, and then you send that into the local government, local authority, municipality, and then it gets legally established, which is what this plan is. And then the next one is to create the policies and the plan. And again, you put it in. It's quite a long process. And we kind of supported the creation of these different reports for them. whether it was through students or it was through funding through European Union and so on and so forth. But the problem is, and that's why I'm talking about an economy for this sphere, is that it was just constantly back and forth or stopping and starting because there wasn't a very clear economic framework to work from the ground up. And I want to just show another, so basically we've got the different things that I've shown, a methodology of being embedded through temporary architecture in parts of the city to do community engagement, from which then other urban projects can emerge, including an urban plan or a master plan, or however you want to call it. The other is, okay, so that neighborhood plan was very much about, it's very much about land. So it isn't really about a social contract. It's really not about how community groups work with the state or public sector or government. This is, again, from the Localism Act, which is community charters. So there's a lot of community charters that are done from the top down by the state or even property developers. That's not what I'm talking about. So this, what we decided, this was commissioned by a local authority in London called Southwark Council. And we started to look at, we read this policy document, which is on your left-hand side. And honestly, even for me, it was really difficult to think, okay, well, how do you actually in reality implement this? So we used art projects as a way to make it very simple, so that community groups and local councillors, local politicians could actually really know how to actually set these up. So the gap usually between policy and what actually really happens on the ground, it's quite a big gap of implementation. So what we created was an illustrated colouring book, children's colouring book, which is these are just 2 of the pages. And I'm happy to share the PDF document if people are interested, of how you actually set up a democratic community charter for a neighborhood, which really sets out the relationship and terms of engagement between the state and the community. And in the community charter, there were things like you have to establish complaints and needs of the community. And we thought, oh my God, who's going to go into an assembly room and confront people with their problems and needs? And it's just going to be a shouting match. So what we decided to do, so we actually worked with a local artist, and he created basically with the local choir, local community choir, a complaints choir. So it was a series of workshops where we transformed the complaints into songs, and they had to sing them at our final event. And I think that kind of process of bringing art into it, so that actually the kind of whole process of processing the needs, the frustrations, the complaints becomes part of the healing somehow, towards, and then you get your message across, and it can be, and then the local government understands what's actually needed. And we created this kind of, at the end, we created this street event, but every element from the charter and the colouring book was performed, from the eating together to bring the communities together to discuss issues, to the listening booth. This was another artist, Claudia Firth, as a kind of Yeah, as an art of listening, and really thinking, okay, so how do we address that? Like working together, so listening, and then over the eating, kind of processing it, and getting to come up with solutions together with local politicians. Then, you know, in every event, I don't know if you have it in other countries, but in the UK, you always have children face painting in community events. So what we did was we used local people. We always kind of use local people, and we pay them to be involved in our project. So very little volunteering. And so the bits of the charter, as they were doing the face painting, they would talk about the charter with the people, so people will start to understand how you can set up the community charter. And then we we also, then a lot of the older community, the older residents who actually live on the street wanted to do a tea dance. So we again engaged different artists, another artist group, to do a high tea, which was again to do with bits of the choreography related to the community charter. So it's really about how very alternative, playful ways that we get to know, we get to learn, and we get to embody certain knowledge that then we can use on an everyday basis. And then also with the food, we also worked with local residents who, again, we paid to produce that. So, so in a way, my interest, you know, I've been doing all those like experimental, playful, there's loads of those projects within the arts that I've been doing. But the Commons was really, okay, then what? You know, how do we institute these so that they can be sustainable long term? And how are governing structures or institutional forms in the community different to those of the state or the corporate sector? They cannot be the same. They don't work when they're they're being borrowed from those sectors, because they don't have the resources. It is about very different things. Imagine if you in your family suddenly say, we're going to create an institution within the family and we're going to deal with it like you deal with it in a corporate sector. It just won't work, because that's not what the logic of relationships, you know, care, emotions is about. It needs a very different self-governing, very different kind of rules in terms of engagement. So these are just my last two slides are really different elements of how you can create these different forms of governance. So the boundary of the commons, so if we say the state is completely public and open and is free for all, for example, then the commons do have boundaries, but they're not as enclosed as the private boundaries. They have it's the biggest design problem of the boundary of the commons, because it's more like a threshold, and it has regimes of access. So what gives you access? And I think these are very important, that they don't become enclosures, that they don't become closed to everybody else. So that is one of the problems that one would face with this. What is the ceremony of access? What is free and open? And what is the degree of restriction? How do you experience the boundary? So these are all the different components that when I'm designing the commons organizations with communities, these are some of the workshops we hold. And the facilitator of the workshop really needs to understand and needs to lead, so they don't become enclosures. And so that's where there are dangers if it all becomes about private interests. So again, the commons membership, what type of membership do people have? What is their role as members within neighborhoods? So we're talking about neighborhoods, right? We're talking about parts of the city. And then what can they influence? What are the types of relationships which are nurtured? How do you deal with conflicts? And the key thing again is that openness and collaborative nature of the commons. So you can have smaller commons like we had with the neighborhood plan, but then you can scale them up into larger commons, which could be trusts, for example, and so on. Another important element is what are the materials, the waste streams, as common pool resources, as assets. What is the method of making? Because if you're co-producing, then that's part of building social relationships. Where are you exchanging these? What are the social and ecological values of what you're creating? Who do you give agency to beyond the people within the commons? What is the material processing? So if there are materials which are very problematic, so if you're using lots of plastics, then I think that's something to be really considered. So again, it has it can become an ecological arena as well. And then terms of engagement are really important. And again, they're done from the community, in the community. So the commons, basically, if we're talking about commons public partnership, these commons then start to have very clear logic, which is much more different to well, they're not much more, but they're different to the state. But they have the right structures in place in order to have a public commons partnership. So I suppose that's what I wanted to share, and actually leave space for us to have more of a discussion. So I hope that's okay there. And I can answer any questions if things. I know it can be quite a difficult concept. So if just fire lots of questions. So I suppose it's been a 25-year journey from models of community engagement on the ground to how we actually make them impactful institutional frameworks.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Khonsari. I will pass it over to Eduardo, Alex, and Reza to lead the question and period. Just so that everyone knows, we will absolutely post slide recording and get that kids coloring book, which I absolutely love, posted on our website. If not, please get in touch with us. But I send it over for questions, and you can ask other questions in the chat. We have around let's see, 50 minutes, so I'll hand it over.
Thanks, Alyssa. Perhaps before we take the questions, we can hear from both Eduardo and Reza. Eduardo is the co-director of the World Urban Pavilion. He has 26 years of experience working in UN Habitat, as well as an academic professor. During his time in UN Habitat, he was the head of knowledge, innovation, and partnerships, leading a number of different activities across all regions of the globe. And then Reza Waziri, who's sitting here with me in the room, is currently the chair of Urban Economy Forum, was also previously the first global advocate of UN Habitat, and similar to Eduardo, has tremendous experience working with UN Habitat and the international community, leading various topics and subjects when it comes to sustainable urbanization. Eduardo, I turn to you first, and then Reza.
Thank you very much. Good morning from Mexico to everyone. Fascinating presentation, Torange. That reminds me my time in Habitat, in which we were pushing for a different kind of governance, in which the commons at community, at the neighborhood level can take place. But it was not always possible, and I would like to make more comments, and also in the way to ask you 2 or 3 questions in order to engage in a discussion. First of all, I fully agree in the history of the commons, there was always an attempt to think that commons were only or basically, for instance, in medieval Europe, the shared agriculture concept, but it was still owned by someone. In Latin America, the foundation of the cities were 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 done on a concept that was called res commons, or the common for everyone. And that was a special area that was called ejido, which means you can freely use that. And that brings me to the first point, this notion of free versus restriction. In the history, Harriet Hardim wrote this tragedy of the commons, and that brings my first form of question to you. Are we in the presence? Harry mentioned that this strategy of the common was the free riders and the people who thought that commons were a free access fundamentally, and not free protection or free governance for protecting. And today, and this is my question, at the country level, are we in the presence of governments that with their libertarian regimes and governance mechanisms are attempting to the creation of commons? I'm thinking in the time of Trump, but now in Argentina with Milei, that is recreating a different concept of free individual libertarian society. And what would be the space for commons there? Let me conclude. You can perhaps take some notes on this. Second, in the UN, where, as Alex mentioned, I was working for 25 years, the commons were present and recently very present in two forms. The Secretary General with the Sustainable Development Goals wanted to recreate the notion of the global commons, and in opposition to local commons. And global commons, of course, understanding ocean, rivers, water, air, etc. But perhaps this notion also have owners. I think in oceans, most of the oceans to some extent have owners. And then how this tragedy of the global commons in the UN concept can be at a planetary scale. That will be my second question. How to change scales would be the scales that you presented, which I fully share, by the way. There was a person who wrote here, Manny. He's referring to the notion of institutionalizing. And to me, that's an important comment, because perhaps it has to do with the idea that in society will be difficult to recreate local commons with some form of not boundaries, but threshold, as you said, but still restricted to some governance mechanism of groups, and how you change the scale to the city, or, and that will be the question, the challenge of the legal and the political system of the commons will not allow that the city itself could be governed in a multitude of local commons. That what would be the possibility of that to happen? In UN Habitat, we wrote a book on prosperity, and we found, and that's an interesting thing, that the most prosperous cities and countries of the world were those that recreated public goods and the notion of the commons. And I think you made a very interesting distinction between public goods and commons. And in this publication of prosperity, we found that we need to recreate, as Osmond, as the Nobel laureate Ostrom mentioned, that the recreation of the notion of local commons would have to do not only with rivers, with fields, but also with urban and social spaces. And these urban and social spaces is something that need to be legalized, institutionalized, as this person mentioned, and needs to be make it viable from a rights perspective. Last comment, and I would stop there. It's you ask a question, what is the economic sustainable model? And I think that brings me to something that is not only community land trust or new governance mechanisms locally, but some form of semi-collective property, perhaps, that we need to study again and bring back, and why we need to bring it back. Again, you mentioned this, and I would like to take it from a different perspective, because we need a new social pact that is life sustainable or thinks in life sustainability, particularly with three threats: the pandemics that may come again, the climate, and some form of inequalities that, in my view, is a global threat. And this new pact will recreate what you said about community charters, but I think it will recreate the notion of mankind and nature in local spaces. And it will create or recreate a new ecological integrity that needs to start local. And that brings me to my last question, is do we need to rethink governance from the very basic level of neighborhoods, perhaps? Or whatever will be a community-based organization? The question would be, to which extent can we learn, not only in Canada, but in many parts of the world, from indigenous governance mechanisms that were to large extent rethinking these social pacts based on this ecological protection and mechanism. I think, for instance, in Bolivia, that protected rivers as persons and give human nature to rivers and to other elements as part of this. So what would be this new political system that can sustain these local pacts? That will be my question. Thank you, Alex.
Great. Thank you so much. What rich set of questions. Incredible. I'll just start from the first one. In terms of the tragedy of the commons, so one of the key things, and I should have talked about this in the talk, is, but I mean, I did say it slightly, but that there is a difference. But so the way we see commons, or the way we understand commons, it's still the notion of communal common good as public good most of the time. So that's what Hardin was talking about as well. He was framing it more as an open access public good. So that is a philosophical theory of commons from a communal common good, which has been written about quite extensively, and I think we use much more. So we're much more familiar with. But there is another conception, which is called a distributive common good, which is the notion which is what we create together collaboratively in action, and we frame as a common good, and we fight for. And that is much less in literature at the moment, but nevertheless, and it's much less used. So that's more the conception that I think the new commons are framing, and the new commons are more about man-made, which then the city is very much, it's very applicable for the city, the new commons, and the global commons, like you talked about as well, and the cultural commons, and so on and so forth. So these are not so much the traditional commons, which are more the natural ones, but the new commons, which are much more man-made. So I suppose we are in this exciting arena where a lot of, since 2008, which is when Ostrom won the Nobel, And some of you might kind of go, ooh, but the blockchain and Bitcoin came along at the same time. So there are also these decentralized technologies which are also emerging that are actually allowing for also a different form of governance, which unfortunately in the public realm, we are not grabbing as much as we should be, because otherwise they'll get privatized just like the internet did. And at the moment, they're public. The blockchain is public right now. And so the blockchain, for those of you who don't know, it's just a way that you make contracts digitally. Yeah, so it's a ledger system. And so what is happening with the blockchain is that we become producers as well as consumers of a lot of things. So be it energy. So for example, I give you an example, which is why it excites me about the commons with this technology, is that there is a company in Australia that a neighborhood that produces their own solar energy as a neighborhood can sell that energy to each other when they have surplus. So actually what that happens, you start to create an energy commons. There might not be an absolute governance for it as such. It's an ownership, it's a contract. And so it can go beyond that. But ownership, similar conversations are being had around ownership with this kind of distributive common good system around how do we start to own. And these can be tangible or intangible assets. So when I was talking about common pool resources, it's very exciting to think what those could be, because it could be knowledge, it could be land, it could be data, it could be many things. But what happens if a community or a neighborhood start to own that and actually become producers and consumers of it and actually monetize it to develop things within the commons, within their own neighborhoods. So then I suppose the social contract that I was talking about was more than how do the commons and the state then have a partnership and a relationship, and so if they are regulating at a much larger scale, how can that relationship actually start to create a much more socially just, environmentally just environment, which then we're not always at the mercy of the corporate finance, which is ultimately has a different logic. Its logic is to make as much profit for its shareholders as possible. So how is that ever gonna be for the common good? So that's maybe that kind of was both with the planetary and the tragedy of the commons. And in terms of the global commons, that's not really my expertise, but James Gilligan, who if you can get to speak at this Pavilion series, would be amazing. He's been talking about global commons. He's an economist. He's very radical. And I can again circulate his a chapter that he's written around the differentiation between the common good and the public good from an economic perspective, and I think he would be fantastic to. He basically talks about borderless commons and how we need borderless commons in order to really deal with socio-environmental justice. I can't reframe it. I think I can definitely send that round. And yes, so I suppose it's all these different scales. So when I was doing a bit of work for ESA with UN Habitat in some of the events, what was striking to me was the gap between policy and the global and the ground. And I think at the time when we were talking, people kept saying, oh yeah, but the NGOs will do it. And then I would talk to the NGOs, I was like, oh, we don't really know how to do it. And so not that they don't all know how to do it, but it was kind of like, well, we need there's too many scales in that between this world. And I think that is also a space of really interesting exploration from the one-to-one, almost like the family, to the global policy, and that scale. There's lots of different forms of practice and different forms of governance and different forms of engage. By practice, I mean how we do something, how we actually make something into action. So there are kind of these different forms and different scales until we get to that larger scale. And each one of those scales requires different skills and different kinds of disciplines and so on. And so, and I suppose that for me was the interesting thing of working as a community engaged artist on the ground, one-to-one, really like hearing stories, racist stories sometimes, in neighborhoods, but being quite unjudgmental and thinking, why are they, and getting them to talk to each other over a meal, then they start to understand each other emotionally. But there are no hosts. There are no hosts in neighborhoods that actually host these different communities coming together who are communities of difference. But who's going to negotiate these different cultural traits, different ways of... And so whenever we tried to put different people together, there was definitely conflict, which were cultural, but we had to find ways to negotiate it. So that's a craft at one level, at one scale. Then there is the other one, which was the scale of a neighborhood or a high street or so on, and then the neighborhood plan, and then the scale of the city, and so on and so forth. But I think each one of them have different forms of practice, and the commons, it's not that everything has to be commons. I just want to be really, really clear about that. I think we need the state, we need the private sector, and we need the commons. So if you think of one development, even if it's a commercial one, we need some which might be social housing or a school within it, which is public and it's a state thing. But then we need one which is the local communities might need a space because they're doing youth projects or they're doing this or that, but they're embedded to the locality. And that's the community bit. And then you have the commercial bit. So you have all three operating in one development, all three of them. But at the moment, what happens, they go, no, we've got community because we've got a playground. That's not community building. That is just a public infrastructure you need to put in place and it has to be there. So I think that's probably the different, I think I answered everything. I don't know.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to you both. There's a couple of comments in the chat and one question, I believe, from Maddie. We'll get to those for sure. I'll have Reza Kubaziri share some remarks in the comments as well.
Okay, thank you so much, dear Torange, for joining us. It's I think we know each other for almost 2.5 decades, probably. Still very young, but
we grew old together.
Yeah, and I appreciate your amazing, perfect presentation. It's really aligned with our current conversation regarding one of the main goals in the United Nations system, public partnership and participatory model of the urban transformation and urbanization. During the last decades, I want to emphasize, introduced Torange as one of the pioneers in the community empowerment based on the architecture. You did a lot in this regard. Public Works is amazing experience, and with lots of different variety of different practices. I want to see what is the impact of your entire experience on the policy, and if you want to emphasize and introduce and explain for us what is the 3 key actions cities need to do to bring this conversation to the reality. What is those? And I believe it's really important for us to try to interpret this conversation to the language and literature of the policy, and starting kind of advocacy of this conversation with the city leaders, with the mayors, with the politicians. And the second question, I believe, what is your vision about the future? I believe we need to have our old-fashioned style of engagement of people that we call kind of democracy. We have a kind of election method. We can involve some representative, and based on advertisement, based on kind of different model of engagement, some people goes to council, and I believe city council could be as one of the main tools for bringing people on the stage, as we believe we are faced with important challenges globally and nationally and locally regarding climate change, regarding consumption, regarding, and in general, we believe we need to change. We need to move forward to the urban transformation. Fundamentally, we are not able to continue this kind of style of urban development, urbanization, and architecture. What is your vision exactly about the close future based on your experience? Personally, I think we need to change, and we will change many things. We are in the process of shifting paradigm, but what is your vision exactly as one of the main experts in this regard?
Okay, thank you so much for that. Challenging me as always. So I'm going to just talk through impact first. So in terms of impact, I suppose they're again at different scales. So the scale of actually securing and giving value to urban land for community use and the use of community organizations is one of those impacts, because and so we've done 5 different sites. I mean, the one I showed you is a really tiny one, but there are 5 different sites. The garden one was another one that we've basically managed to take out of the private land circulation, private development land circulation. That is really important, to have a city that isn't all commercialized and it's not all housing. You have to have different functions. And so now that we've kind of understood that mechanism, what I'm teaching at the Architectural Association now is we're kind of scaling that up. So each one of the students is working with different community organizations. So that's 12 sites, 8 per neighborhood. And we have to see how far we can get with it. But I think that needs to we need to scale that up. And a lot of the problem is that local governments don't have the resources to creatively think or engage with people to what could happen on these sites and who's going to take it on and all of that. So they'll always go for the easiest option, which is either the easy public stuff, which needs a lot of money, be it school, museums, that kind of stuff, or it just goes into housing or commercial developments of shops, malls, commercial. So that shifts already the image of the city, like the way we would start to look at the city. The other thing which I'm working on, but again, I'm piloting right now by thinking about the commons. If we start to bring industry, and by that, I mean production industry. So I have a fashion student, for example, who's working with the commons, and she's looking at, and that's probably another talk, but she's looking at how you can change the high street if you really localize the way you produce fashion or recycle fabrics, or you can, so instead of shops only being for consumption, you also have shops that are producing at small scale, local scale. So again, that shifts the way we start to, which is community run, enterprises which are community run and so on. So it can have these different layers. Now at policy level, so I was involved with one particular local authority in London, which is called London Borough of Islington, and they wanted to know for the entire borough, and a borough in London is like 250,000 people, so it's like a small city in other contexts. So they wanted to see what could be their strategy or policy for social equality in Islington. And I was part of the task force that could develop that policy. And a few of us really pushed for, rather than the agenda being the elderly, health, housing, because they said, oh, we just pick 2 or 3 of those. We said, no, pick empowerment as your main policy agenda, and then write a policy around how you could empower your citizens or your residents, because through empowerment, then they would, empowering programs that you invest in, then you can start to do housing, or no, you can't do housing, sorry. Then they could kind of get involved in finding housing or getting jobs, or so when you empower people, they can start to do things for themselves, and you don't alienate the elderly by going for housing, or so on and so forth. So that's what they're implementing right now, and the students' work at the Architectural Association is embedded in implementing a pilot in one neighborhood for that. So in a way, it's always, for me, the policy needs to go hand in hand with its implementation, not as an abstract, but as a concrete, real, how do we actually do it? So I can report back in a year or so with that one, because we've just started it. But it is some of the components that I was talking to you guys about will all be in that project, but it'll be at a scale of a neighborhood, which then Islington would want to scale up across the whole of the borough. Of course, when we do that, then we can go to the Mayor of London and see whether it starts to scale up across London. So I suppose but I'm quite keen that we don't abstract layers. So we really do it quite carefully at those different scales that I was talking about. And in a way, if you say about the democratic models of how local authorities kind of can do these things, I give you another example that I didn't design it. I was a resident that participated. It was another local authority in London who did citizens' assemblies to develop policies. And that was really fantastic, because so in a borough in London, you have different wards. So the different wards are smaller areas, so if a borough is 250,000, then each ward is, I don't know, about 30,000 people, 40,000 people. So each one of those wards, they had citizens' assemblies where people could start to talk about what they're really concerned about. We did that for the neighborhood plan as well. We had citizens' assemblies for the neighborhood plans. So those go on a board, you know, and the most popular comes up, most popular concern of that ward. And then those go into different tables, gets developed into actions. How do we action those things? What kind of projects could we do to action those things? And then a steering group to action those. People can nominate themselves. It goes into a hat. People pick, somebody picks out of a hat who the steering committee is, to be as democratic as possible. And then that steering committee develops the different agendas, the different projects as projects. Each one has allocation of funds. Each one of the projects would get an allocation of funds. And then that goes into an assembly again, gets voted on, and so on and so forth until it's implemented. I wasn't involved when it was the implementation of the project, because I was just involved during the process. And so I think at that level, that for me is one of those commons public partnership models. That's one of those kind of governance systems. So I talked about the charter as one. This assemblies is another one. So that there'll be like series of models that, I mean, I can't think from the top of my head all of them, but there are a series of models where these can come together. But if you don't have the commons developed on the ground, then you will get always the same type of people going to the assemblies. Yeah, those who are already empowered, those who are already confident enough, not necessarily from other ethnic backgrounds, not necessarily from different, you know, and that was the interesting thing, that in one of those art projects that I didn't show, I was working with women from different cultures, and because they had built a trust relationship with us, we could take them to the assembly. There is no way they would have come to an assembly. Absolutely no way. So if you want to, so, you know, you always kind of have people go, yeah, but it has to be representational. But if it's representational and we're all different ethnic backgrounds, but actually all confident and empowered, that's just tokenistic, right? That's not actually socially creating social mobility. And that's why I'm saying it's really important to be aware of all the scales. Otherwise, the social justice side doesn't work. And I suppose with your 3 action points, that's really hard. But I think for me, the advocacy is really this awareness of these different scales, that they have different practices and different logics. That is really important, because I don't think the political arena understands that. Like here, when I talk to the ministries here, they don't understand that this is, so when they say communities, they mean local authority. They don't mean people on the ground. That's why we have the disconnect in politics between what's happening on the ground, and that's why people are losing trust. And that worries me. For democracy, that worries me, because then people say, oh, well, democracy failed. Democracy hasn't failed, just we haven't put the right system still in place for that, in a multicultural system, for that to actually work. So for me, the commons are really important to rejuvenate democracy, actually, you know, and so, and again, you know, in that blockchain world, it terrifies me, because it's so liberal, it's so neoliberal, that they're all going, oh, we don't need the state. And that's frightening, because that just becomes, you know, privatization on steroids. So I suppose the advocacy is really understanding these different practices, the different logics, and actually, there's a lot of people I've worked with in local government that are not interested in communities. they're just very much there, you know, they're bureaucrats, you know, and I'm not saying all bureaucrats are like that, but I'm just saying it. So how does that culture become vibrant in those environments as well? I don't know if I didn't give you 3, but
I'm not mute. You mean we need to educate government?
I think there needs to be capacity building, but not just at government level, at community level as well. I think there's a lot of capacity building work that has to be done. You know, until quite recently in the UK, there was no educational budgets or funds for at government level, at local authority level. They're beginning to do it now. And at community level, forget about it. Like, who's going to fund it? But in a way, if you don't, what the problem, there are also problems currently at community level because they start to repeat either corporate culture at community level, because that's where they're working. Some of these volunteers or residents are working in a corporate context. So you're working in a corporate context, that's what you understand as a way you engage with other people, or in the state, yeah? And then you replicate that at a community level, and then there are power games that start to be played out, and people get silenced, there becomes tyranny. So you can also have tyranny of the community. So I think that also needs education and capacity building. Yeah, I think at both level, that's key to empowerment, actually, and change.
Very, very good. Thank you so much, Torange.
Well,
So Torange, I just want to pay respects to our people participating in the chat here. Manny has been very engaged in our conversation. Thank you so much, Manny. It's always great to see that these physical and virtual worlds are interacting seamlessly. Manny had shared 2 comments, which I think have already been addressed through the discussion. They're more just general comments, sharing ideas. But one question that Manny had asked, what is your idea about the different starting points beyond these key issues of the common good or ownership? A basic undeniable need of human beings is expressing their feelings, fears, sadness, grief, and so on. Maybe at the ground, people need to release their repressed feelings before engaging these little complicated legal notions. Yeah,
no, absolutely. You would never go in with the legal stuff first. So it's absolutely about, it is absolutely about those emotional, more, that's why I was kind of likening it to a family. And you know, then there are issues of emotional labor and all of that with the facilitators. But so the way I would go in, I would usually just host and listen. You know, that a lot of it, I just want to get to know people, just like you would in a, you know, if you're going to a party or whatever, that you're getting to know people. So a lot of it, I'm just listening. I'm not giving them anything. And actually, I don't talk about the commons for at least a year. You know, when I'm in a community setting. So it's a lot about really sympathizing as well. So, you know, it does take particular type of people who like to do this. So I have students who have no interest in community engagement, and I actually don't let them do it because I think it's fundamentally worse. And you have to, you know, you have to have that. It's kind of much more, I can't describe it. It's an inner nurturing kind of intuitive. I think Mani is an anthropologist from what I understand. So I think that's something the anthropologists and people who work with people or professions that work with people would have that understanding much better than a lot of architects who would not have had that training. So I think a lot of the time it's actually about empathy and allowing people. So that's when I was talking about the choir. A lot of those people's needs and frustrations came out in these workshops, and then it was really a lot of fun to turn them into songs, because they were processing it through that kind of process of transforming it into something playful, and it doesn't remain at the end of the workshop as something like aggressive. And so sometimes maybe people, I mean, the terms of engagement is, however, really important. So I don't allow in my sessions kind of aggressive behavior personally, because I don't know how to deal with it. It's not my, and so I think if there are aggressive behaviors, I kind of talk to them personally, because it changes the dynamic in the room. And so I meet with them separately. And I also really, that's where you set certain boundaries. And then you say, well, if you need help, there are these other kind of channels, but we can't do it in this. They could evolve, like not every single one is the same. There could be some kind of groups or some commons that really, if you start to develop it as an ecosystem, there could be those you refer them to that actually just are experts in this, but I'm not, so I can't deal with it. I know how to do conflict resolution because I've done quite a bit of research around it, but I can't deal with people coming in and just wanting to be aggressive. So there are lots of things like this that you have to be prepared, and that's why I'm saying it's a craft that that interdisciplinary groups are need to kind of develop or have to deal on that, on that level. And a lot of people are not interested, and that's why I'm saying not everything can be a commons. We need, there are people with different interests, with different logics, with different, so there needs to be spheres that allows for people in all those different contexts to have a place. But at the moment, what's happening, there are a lot of people who I speak to who would like to work and earn money within a community sector, and they can't because there are no jobs in that field, or very little. So then we're missing that community development as a sphere. And so that's probably my one message that we're missing, and we have to build this sphere. I don't know if I answered, Manny, but.
Yes, and hopefully Manny is appreciating you for the reply here. I am cognizant of time. We have about 7 minutes left. Again, Manny's been so engaged. And I think, Torange, you did address this final comment that Manny had here, who's talking about the need, the possibility of working with social psychologists to help navigate some of this process that you're speaking about here, and setting up safe spaces, engaging with the emotions of the public, and how that can impact the ultimate outcome of this process here. Torange, I don't know if you want to make any additional remarks on the final comment.
I suppose one thing I would say is that so I always talked about, whenever people ask what do you do, or what's your discipline, and I always would go, well, I trained as an architect, and then I did public art. So it would be like this whole I worked with anthropologists, and I work with theatre, and then it was like a paragraph. And the commons, what was interesting, I didn't have to do that. They're naturally interdisciplinary, or they naturally have to be interdisciplinary in order for them to operate. And the one thing, the challenge of interdisciplinarity and needs patience is that we are socialized in different languages and different ways of communicating and different ways of framing things. So we spend quite a lot of time meaning the same thing, but fighting over because we think we're saying different things. So I think that kind of language and phrases and typology of phrases and would be really good to kind of almost explain at the at the beginning of a project between different disciplines, and just be patient with each other, I think. So anyway, I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Torange. And perhaps we have 5 minutes left. Perhaps Eduardo and Torange can make closing remarks here. Perhaps. That's closing remarks.
Thank you. More than closing, and maybe we don't have time, but something that I like a lot in your presentation, Torange, is that this idea of creating new semantics to things.
Yeah.
For instance, I captured 2 or 3 of what you said, changing boundaries to thresholds. And the second one, perhaps even walls to bridges.
Yeah.
And the notion of resemantizing, if I can use that word, producers and consumers concept and relationships. And that brings me to a question. Who is the one who negotiates differences that you mentioned? What kind of professionals are we talking about if these are professionals? And if this includes, and I connect to a Reza question on education, that we need at the goal 12 in the consumption and production levels of behavior, also some changes associated to that.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I really loved that walls to bridges as well comment. I think, well, I think this negotiation actually is a skill and a craft that, again, I think it should be an interdisciplinary duo. If you don't spend years and years and years crafting. So if it's anthropologists together with urban planners, because if we're I'm talking about a city context. So within that urban context, I think it's really good to also understand the urban setting or understand the architectural setting. So actually a kind of duo collaborative facilitation between social scientists or anthropologists, psychologists, and urban planners and architects. I think these kind of collaborations as facilitators becomes really interesting. And again, if you see it as a timeline over those collaborations, then people can, the architect will understand enough about the psychological aspects because they've been learning from the other person that they might be able to do it by themselves, but it becomes an expertise. I think it's a new expertise that we need to kind of be thinking about as this kind of facilitator host within the city. And I also, we're talking human a lot at the moment, but that could also be hosts with the non-human, with like let's not go there right now, but in a way, I think it is a real expertise, both in terms of the whole commons development as a sphere becomes this new arena of kind of knowledge and expertise, and the facilitation goes with it, because you have to, as a facilitator, you have to not bring your idea so much in. It's like, but actually, but make sure that if it's really around social justice, which is what the commons are, then that's at the forefront. That the democratic models and all of those models are in the forefront. Otherwise, what you might get, which is really scary, is people who call it commons and then they do a kind of gated community and develop a gated community and say, well, we are a commons. Well, that's an enclosure. It is not a threshold. Okay. So
thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Torange, Eduardo, other participants. Based on your kind of clarification regarding the main top 3 priorities. You mentioned about advocacy and you mentioned about education, try capacity building with the government, with the kind of local authorities, and creating kind of a common language with them to engage them, inspire them to bring and share some of the power with the citizens as well. I want to suggest we need do some practices as a kind of pilot project, as you mentioned correctly. I'm really keen in the next future event we can have kind of more explanation about your project in AA. I'm sure that would be a great example for our audience in the World Bank Pavilion as a tangible practice. And I want to emphasize our vision in urban economy is thinking or rethinking about economy and thinking about resources beyond the kind of traditional definition of economy, thinking about resources and thinking how we are able to unlock untapped resources and engage a public to participate for better quality of life. And this is some things that we expect all the discipline participate in the interdisciplinary platform, architect, anthropologist, sociologist, and different disciplines. And also we need to create through the pilot project a model of engagement with the government to do some of the project with enough resources as a kind of pioneer project to change the kind of old-fashioned sample of urban development. Do you agree with me?
Yeah, no, definitely. I suppose one of my questions has always been that, how much of so I'm not talking about social enterprise, like in terms of economy, how you bring economy. So whenever I'm working in community groups, people always one of the main things is that they all want to make money. They're less likely to want to volunteer to kind of, unless they're a particular class on have time and, and all the rest. So I started to, and this is really uncooked, so forgive me if it comes across badly. But so what happens if we completely think about that triangle of the public, the private, and the commons, where actually there is. So can you produce a commons that is non-for-profit, but financially viable, where it's using those resources that you're talking about? So you tap into those. So for example, I was talking about the fashion example, if they collectively run a fashion mill, and they can actually, so there could be lots of different elements. They can have a farm where they grow dyes, so can you start to think about localized industries, but not as a hierarchical business, but more as a horizontal commons organization, which 50% or more of its intent is community development and public good support, So actually, if it becomes like a social enterprise, it's mainly a business with a social purpose. So you still have the hierarchical positioning. But if you have it as a commons, that means everybody has a voice to influence, right? So if you want to have happy people, happy people are people who have power. Yeah, not to kind of have power all the time, concentrated, but actually this power shifts. So in our organization, my colleague, who's a director, does things completely different to me. So ecology and things, waste streams. So he's an expert in that. Even if I'm senior to him, he's an expert in that. So he has power and influence over that knowledge in our organization. Yeah, as opposed to, I might have a lot more kind of connections and contact with public sector and policymakers and whatever, but that's what I like doing. So that's where I have power. So I think if you all design it so that there's distributed power, then you're going to have much better mental health and happiness in an organization than in an organization where the influence is on the top and everybody at the bottom is just implementing, you know, or something. So I think, and it doesn't mean, you know, it's like, it's just a design process of how do you design influence so that everybody in your organization or in the organization has a level of influence. And I think it doesn't have to be they have to have all the influence, but has a level of influence that they're happy with. And I think that's honestly, then you don't get people in community groups who need power because they're not having it in their workplace, you know, so then they start to be really like power hungry in the community group, and it's destructive. So I think that, you know, we can talk forever because there's so many nuances and so many details that I've been kind of exploring and writing about. So yeah, anyway. But I think if we create fair organizations, and now there's a lot of literature around aesthetic of organizations, so beautiful organizations or ugly organizations. And so the beautiful ones are happier ones. So if we can be very crass about it.
Wow, well, I mean, what a conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Khonsari. Like you said, I could probably talk about this for hours. So with the limited time we have, lots of takeaways, lots for everyone to think about. Thank you so much once again. And thank you to everyone who has joined us today, for those who participated in the chat. We hope you enjoyed it. Like I mentioned before, we will be posting the recordings, the slides, and that kids coloring book on our website shortly. So please make sure to check on our website, follow us on social media so that you know about our next Pavilion talk. And with that being said, thank you very much to everyone who joined, and once again to Dr. Khonsari. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you, and the amazing discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much.